I hope you don't mind that I do actually have a few slides because I find that they're helpful for distracting and are a little more interesting maybe than me. So I won't give you a big background on CCIJ, but just for those of you who might want to know, we have our main office in Ottawa, but I've been here in Vancouver for a little over a year in our Western Canada office, so I'm thrilled to be here and to have the opportunity to do work here. And I was going to thank Ruben for welcoming us here and welcoming me as well to this area, which I'm thrilled to be working at here. So just to set the context for you, and I am talking here about operations outside of Canada, outside of Aboriginal lands here. Just many of you will know these things, but I think they're important to note. So more than 75% of the world's mining and exploration companies are Canadian. And one of the difficulties when you're dealing with operations overseas is that often the Canadian companies operate through foreign companies that are their subsidiaries, and they may own the subsidiaries 100% or 95%, but those subsidiaries are incorporated under foreign law, and that has a lot to do with difficulties in legal accountability here in Canada. And as you may or may not know, a lot of Canadian mining companies are actually financed by EDC, a Crown corporation, and now I'm sure many of you have been hearing in the news about how CETA now is redirecting its funding to private initiatives where mining companies are also now going to be receiving funding through CETA. So the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, which is a pro-industry group, commissioned a report, a secret report, that looked at 1999 to 2009 Canadian mining companies abroad. So it is important that this is a pro-industry group that commissioned this report that was then leaked by Mining Watch Canada, or leaked to them, and then they made it public. So in that report, they concluded that Canadian companies operating overseas had 4 times more incidents than companies from any other country around the world. And to tell you what incidents means, there's the chart that they had in the report. One of the conclusions was that Canadian companies were much more prone to conflict with local communities than companies from other countries. Not to say that other companies don't have that issue. But you can see there that community conflict is a particularly problematic issue, and that certainly goes into the issue of mining. But you also see there are a lot of environmental incidents and human rights incidents as well. So I'm going to give you one example, and this is a case that I worked on. There are plenty of other examples, but I think that this one is pretty stark, and because it's a case that I worked on, I like to use it as an example. So Anvil Mining was an Australian mining company, but it specifically in 2004 reincorporated in Canada. It's incorporated in Yellowknife. And they specifically reincorporated their company in Canada because they wanted access to Canadian capital markets. They wanted access to money that comes through Canada and is generated in Canada because Canada is the place to be for mining operations. It also allowed them to list their company on the TSX and to have access to all of that financing. So that was January 2004. In October 2004, so 10 months later, Anvil was involved in the Kilwa massacre in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In that massacre, there were between 70 and 100 civilians who were murdered by the Congolese military with the support of Anvil and the involvement of Anvil. We're going to, and I know Fiona will talk about this as well, there's a whole range of incidences, was the word that was used in that report, and the way that Canadian companies may be involved in incidents, and that can range from very indirect to, in my opinion, on Anvil, the most direct I've ever seen. So in that massacre, when 70 to 100 civilians were killed, Anvil used their trucks and planes that they were leasing to actually bring Congolese soldiers to the area where the massacre happened. They used Anvil's drivers. Anvil's trucks, according to the evidence that we have and the allegations we made in the case, their trucks actually transported corpses of civilians who had been murdered. And Anvil paid some of the soldiers, including one of the allegations was that they paid the colonel who was in charge of the entire operation. Now, these are, as I said, I think these are the most egregious facts that I've seen, but it's indicative of a problem going on. One of the problems is that there's a complete lack of regulation in Canada. We have a voluntary counselor that was created by the government that nobody was really calling for, and all they can do is play, as they say, a facilitation role. So it's not binding. Companies can enter it or withdraw from it whenever they want, and that's what's happened. And many of you will know about Bill C-300, which was not going to impose criminal penalties or anything like that on companies. It was simply going to say that EDC couldn't finance, that the Crown Corporation couldn't finance their operations anymore, and it would have allowed victims to file complaints with the Minister of Foreign Affairs that then would have been investigated. That bill was defeated, not only by the Conservatives, but also with support of some of the Liberals, including Michael Ignatieff not showing up to vote. I'm not going to have a lot of time to go through, but when you don't have any other options, one of the things that we as lawyers do is we look to the courts. And there have been 4 civil lawsuits filed in Canadian courts involving human rights issues. Anvil is one of them, and that was the case in Quebec. There's a current case ongoing against Hudbay in Toronto, and then those 2 others. As you can see, those are all in Ontario and Quebec. We haven't had any in BC or in Alberta, in spite of the presence of most of these companies in our own backyard here. That may change. I'm not going to have time to go through all the details of this, but one of the problems that we're dealing with is, you can see all the flags there. And Anvil's a tiny little company, and yet it's connected to Australia, because it started out as an Australian company and had its headquarters there, but it was reincorporated in Canada. Its operations were in the Congo. They later moved their office to South Africa, and now they've been bought out by a Chinese company. So the question is, where do you go to sue them? I'm not going to have the time to go into this. I'm happy to do this in questions, but all this is to tell you that our lawsuit, we lost. And we lost on basic issues, that they wouldn't let us go into court in Quebec because they said we didn't have enough connections there, and they said we could go other places like the Congo or Australia. So to conclude, I'm going to flip through this and get to the end. So right now, none of the cases in Canadian courts have succeeded. That Hudbay case is the only one still left. And so we're in a situation where there's been no success in civil lawsuits in Canadian courts. There have been no criminal prosecutions. Bill C-300 was defeated. The counselor is voluntary and has no real powers. So there are 2 key points. One is we need help from the courts. We need judges to have an open mind in looking at how these cases are done. And we need to put pressure on the public and on politicians to raise awareness about these issues, because that's how we're going to bring more attention to the issue and get change. And certainly there are people in this room, Fiona and many others have done fantastic work in the last several years to bring a lot of attention to this issue, but it's one where I think we still need an awful lot more to be done. So I'll leave any other details if people are interested in questions. I'm happy to go into more detail, so thank you.